Well, actually, we should say that those of you who've been listening to the broadcast that we've been having on KFJC since about 1979, 1980, know that we have talked at great length and in almost nauseating detail, nauseating at least to any citizen with an ounce of scruples and belief in good government, about the connections between our intelligence establishment and not only ours, of course, but many intelligence establishments and the drug trade. The fact that as the intelligence establishments began to become things unto themselves after World War II, and as they began to go with a policy of basically the Cold War policy of continuous engagement at low level, and as is becoming even more important in the Reagan 1980s, when the whole Cold War philosophy of small brushfire wars has become the order of the day. Well, it's very difficult to fund these types of wars through normal, legitimate, and legal political means, because most of the American people don't want to see their representatives voting for things like aid to the Contras, aid to the Mujahideen above a certain amount, things of that nature. And especially they don't want to see people supporting, say, the white hand death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala and places like that, which many times our intelligence and political establishments have felt to be the order of the day for continuing their anti-communist political philosophies. And as a result, they have to go elsewhere for money, and undetectable sums of money. And they found that the best ways to do this are gun running, drug running, or combinations thereof. And we have spent the last several months on these Radio Free America broadcasts looking in quite a bit of depth at how that has come to evolve as a national strategy, especially for the United States, but also for the Western nations in general.
Now, on this evening's broadcast, we're going to be taking a look at the intelligence services, particularly the CIA's role in the LSD phenomenon. Once again, we will see the Central Intelligence Agency involved in a pivotal way in the actual trafficking in LSD, and we'll also see the interrelationship between the LSD traffic and the arms traffic, a theme that's become almost numbing and certainly fairly depressing as we've examined it over the course of these broadcasts, and indeed I think that could be safely said of the entire overview of the guns and drugs trades, which are in fact one trade and very closely interrelated. On this evening's broadcast, we're going to begin by taking a look at the growth of the LSD phenomenon, specifically the spread of LSD in American society is inextricable with the activities of the CIA and military in the United States. And we're going to begin taking a look at how LSD and its use and testing began out of a CIA program that was basically a search for a truth serum. We're going to take a look at the way in which the CIA's research into LSD spurred LSD research all around the country. Then we're going to take a look at the actual growth of the LSD subculture, so to speak. In particular, we're going to take a look at some of the main proponents of LSD, or the use of LSD for recreational purposes. We're going to take a look at a guy named Captain Al Hubbard, who, unlike Ken Kesey or Tim Leary, was the original LSD pioneer. He also was a lifelong U.S. intelligence agent and a very, very mysterious character. We're going to take a look at the ubiquitous role of the CIA in the spreading of the LSD doctrine, so to speak, to leading American intellectuals. Whether we're looking at the aforementioned Tim Leary or Ken Kesey, whether we're looking at Aldous Huxley, whether we're looking at Allen Ginsberg, in the background of each of these key LSD proselytizers' introduction to that drug, we find the Central Intelligence Agency and people who were pivotally involved in the CIA's testing efforts. LSD research was virtually unknown in this country until the CIA, through a number of domestic funding conduits, began pumping millions of dollars into research with this drug. We're going to take a look at the CIA's role in the Summer of Love, the 20th anniversary of which is about to break upon us here in the Bay Area with a lot of, and this is my editorial comment, revolting commemorations of that phenomenon. And it should be said, too, that the book that we're going to rely on for a lot of our broadcasts this evening, although it has a lot of excellent information, does wax, I find, nauseatingly maudlin with regard to the psychedelic era, quote-unquote. The book sort of splits between devastating and insightful analysis and a lot of essentially nostalgic and I think fairly useless rumination and reminiscing about the glories of the psychedelic era. What conclusion one comes to about just what the CIA and other intelligence agencies were up to with regard to the use of LSD. Again, for the purposes of brevity, the thesis of the entire broadcast this evening is basically that the CIA is totally inseparable from the LSD phenomenon in America, whether we look at LSD as a research tool, as it was initially, or whether we look at it as the underground recreational drug of choice that it became in the 1960s. Throughout the growth and spread of the LSD phenomenon, the CIA is there, and again, are completely inseparable from it. At the end of the broadcast this evening, we're going to speculate to a certain extent about some of the things that they may have had in mind with their efforts.
That's right. Not only for you ex-hippies out there, not only is 1987 the 20th anniversary of the, quote, Summer of Love, unquote, it's also the 40th anniversary of the formation of the CIA. And for those of you out there who are not previously familiar with the overlap that Dave mentioned between those two phenomena, you will be probably rather interested to stay tuned with us for tonight's broadcast. I just also wanted to mention that the book that we're going to be using heavily, not exclusively, but almost exclusively tonight, as Dave mentioned, is a book called Acid Dreams, subtitled The CIA, LSD, and the 60s Rebellion. The book is written by Martin A. Lee and Bruce Schlain, S-H-L-A-I-N, copyright 1985 by Grove Press, New York, and it is certainly worth your while. It is out right now. It is available, I think, in a lot of bookstores. It is probably also available in your local libraries and a variety of other places, and we are going to be covering a lot of it tonight, but obviously we cannot read the entire book to you, and it wouldn't hurt at all to go out and buy a copy and support researchers doing this kind of work. So, again, that small commercial over. Acid Dreams is the book we're going to be quoting from heavily tonight.
Okay, and again, we're going to begin by taking a look at the history of the CIA's research into LSD and the military's research into LSD, and observe the manner in which their interest in acid, which grew out of a number of different CIA mind control programs, part of which focused on the search for a truth serum. Basically, this is where LSD got its start in American society. It was, as we're going to read here very shortly, virtually an unknown phenomenon. There was almost no one doing LSD research in the United States until the CIA began pumping a lot of capital into that type of research. All of a sudden, there were a lot of people doing that research. Very quickly, the drug spread from the laboratory to the street, and we will be analyzing the possible role of the CIA in affecting that switch deliberately.
All right, starting out from Acid Dreams and reading about the early days of the search for a truth serum or a truth drug that would enable interrogators to basically pick the brains clean. This was the original idea, pick the brains clean of foreign spies.
It should be noted here that in the search for a truth serum, the CIA picked up where the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, left off during World War II, the OSS being America's wartime intelligence service during WW II.
After the war, the CIA and the military picked up where the OSS had left off in the secret search for a truth serum. The Navy took the lead when it initiated Project Chatter in 1947, the same year that the CIA was formed. Described as, quote, an offensive program, Chatter was supposed to devise means of obtaining information from people independent of their volition, but without physical duress. Toward this end, Dr. Charles Savage conducted experiments with mescaline, a semi-synthetic extract of the peyote cactus that produces hallucinations similar to those caused by LSD, at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. But these studies, which involved animal as well as human subjects, did not yield an effective truth serum, and Chatter was terminated in 1953. The Navy became interested in mescaline as an interrogation agent when American investigators learned of mind control experiments carried out by the Nazi doctors at the Dachau concentration camp during World War II. After administering the hallucinogen to 30 prisoners, the Nazis concluded that it was, quote, impossible to impose one's will on another person, as in hypnosis, even when the strongest dose of mescaline had been given, unquote. But the drug still afforded certain advantages to SS interrogators, who were consistently able to draw, quote, even the most intimate secrets from the subject when questions were cleverly put. Not surprisingly, quote, sentiments of hatred and revenge were exposed in every case, unquote. The mescaline experiments at Dachau were described in a lengthy report by the U.S. Naval Technical Mission, which swept across Europe in search of every scrap of industrial material and scientific data that could be garnered from the fallen Reich. This mission set the stage for the wholesale importation of more than 600 top Nazi scientists under the auspices of Project Paperclip, which the CIA supervised during the early years of the Cold War. Among those who emigrated to the U.S. in such a fashion was Dr. Hubertus Strughold, spelled Strughold, the German scientist whose chief subordinates, Dr. Sigmund Ruff and Dr. Sigmund Rascher, were directly involved in, quote, aviation medicine experiments at Dachau, which included the mescaline studies. Despite recurring allegations that he sanctioned medical atrocities during the war, Strughold settled in Texas and became an important figure in America's space program. After Werner von Braun, he was the top Nazi scientist employed by the American government, and he was subsequently hailed by NASA as the, quote, father of space medicine, unquote. The CIA, meanwhile, had launched an intensive research effort geared toward developing special interrogation techniques. Two methods showed promise in the late 1940s. The first involved narcohypnosis, in which a CIA psychiatrist attempted to induce a trance state after administering a mild sedative. A second technique involved the combination of two different drugs with a contradictory effect. A heavy dose of barbiturates was given to knock the subject out, and then he received an injection of a stimulant, usually some type of amphetamine. As he started to come out of a somnambulant state, he would reach a certain ineffable point prior to becoming fully conscious. Described in CIA documents as, quote, the twilight zone, this groggy condition was considered optimal for interrogation. CIA doctors attempted to extend the stuporous limbo as long as possible. In order to maintain the delicate balance between consciousness and unconsciousness, an intravenous hookup was inserted in both the subject's arms. One set of works contained a downer, the other an upper, the classic goofball effect. With a mere flick of the finger, an interrogator could regulate the flow of chemicals. The idea was to produce a, quote, push, a sudden outpouring of thoughts, emotions, confidences, and whatnot. Along this line, various combinations were tested. Seconal and dexedrine, pentothal and disoxin, and, depending on the whim of the spy in charge, some marijuana, the old OSS standby, which the CIA referred to as sugar, might be thrown in for good measure.
Continuing with acid dreams. The goofball approach was not a precision science. There were no strictly prescribed rules or operating procedures regarding what drugs should be employed in a given situation. The CIA interrogators were left to their own devices, and a certain degree of recklessness was perhaps inevitable. In one case, a group of CIA experts hastily drafted a memo after reviewing a report prepared by one of the agency's special interrogation teams. The medical consultants pointed out that, quote, the amounts of scopolamine administered were extremely heavy, unquote. They also noted that the best results were obtained when 2 or at most 3 different chemicals were used in a session. In this case, however, heavy doses of scopolamine were administered along with thiamine, sodium luminol, atropine sulfate, sodium pentothal, and caffeine sulfate. One of the CIA's professional consultants in H techniques also questioned why hypnosis was attempted, quote, after a long and continuous use of chemicals, after the subject had vomited, and after apparently a maximum tolerance point had been reached with the chemicals, unquote. Everyone who read the interrogation report agreed that hypnosis was useless, if not impossible, under such conditions. Nevertheless, the memo concluded by reaffirming that, quote, no criticism is intended whatsoever, unquote, and that, quote, the choice of operating weapons must be left to the agents in the field. Despite the potential hazards and tenuousness of the procedure as a whole, special interrogations were strongly endorsed by the agency officials. A CIA document dated November 26, 1951 announced, quote, we're now convinced that we can maintain a subject in a controlled state for a much longer period of time than we heretofore had believed possible. Furthermore, we feel that by use of certain chemicals or combinations, we can, in a very high percentage of cases, produce relevant information, unquote. Although these techniques were still considered experimental, the prevailing opinion among members of the special interrogation teams was that there had been enough experiments, quote, to justify giving the green light to operational use of the techniques, unquote. And again quoting, there will be many a failure, a CIA scientist acknowledged, but he was quick to stress that every success with this method will be pure gravy. In an effort to expand its research program, the CIA contacted academics and other outside experts who specialized in areas of mutual interest. Liaison was established with the research sections of police departments and criminology laboratories. Medical practitioners, professional hypnotists, and psychiatrists were brought on as paid consultants, and various branches of the military provided assistance. Oftentimes, these arrangements involved a cover to conceal the CIA's interest in behavior modification. With the bureaucratic apparatus already in place, the CIA's mind control efforts were integrated into a single project under the code name Bluebird. Due to the extreme sensitivity of the project, the usual channels of authorization were bypassed. Instead of going through Project's Review Committee, the proposal for Bluebird was submitted directly to CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkoetter, last name Hillenkoetter, who authorized the use of unvouchered funds to finance the hush-hush undertaking. Let me read that last sentence again. Due to the extreme sensitivity of the project, the usual channels of authorization were bypassed. Instead of going through the Project's Review Committee, the proposal for Bluebird was submitted directly to CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkoetter, who authorized the use of such unvouchered funds to finance the hush-hush undertaking. With this seal of approval, the CIA's first major drug testing program was officially hatched. Bluebird was to remain a carefully guarded secret, for if word of the program leaked out, it would have been a great embarrassment and a detriment to American intelligence. As one CIA document put it, quote, Bluebird material was, quote, not fit for public consumption, unquote. From the outset, the CIA's mind control program had an explicit domestic angle. It's a very important sentence, and we should store this away for future reference in this broadcast. Beginning again. From the outset, the CIA's mind control program had an explicit domestic angle. A memo dated July 13, 1951, described the agency's mind-bending efforts as, quote, broad and comprehensive, involving domestic and overseas activities, and taking into consideration the programs and objectives of other departments, principally the military services, unquote, end quote. Bluebird activities were designed to create an exploitable alteration of personality, unquote, in selected individuals. Specific targets included, quote, potential agents, defectors, refugees, POWs, and a vague category of others, unquote. A number of units within the CIA participated in this endeavor, including the inspection and security staff, the forerunner of the Office of Security, which assumed overall responsibility for running the program and dispatching the special interrogation teams. Colonel Sheffield Edwards, the chairman of the Bluebird Steering Committee, consistently pushed for a more reliable speech-inducing substance. By the time Bluebird evolved into Operation Artichoke, the formal change in code names occurred in August of 1951, security officials were still searching for the magic technique, the deus ex machina, that would guarantee surefire results. I'm going to run back here and read a footnote. Now, it should be noted here that the search for the truth serum got its impetus to a certain extent from the OSS's wartime activities and received some direction from the research done into the mind-altering effects of chemicals conducted by the Nazi scientists and intelligence officials that were brought into this country at the end of World War II. We've gone into that connection at great length on these tapes. It should be noted that one of the things which it couldn't be said that we inherited it from this Nazi group, because human beings had been used for the purposes of unwitting experimentation before in American society. We talked about the famous Tuskegee experiment in our Radio Free America program 16, but it should be noted that the importation of all of these Third Reich alumni at the end of the war spurred in a tremendous way the inclination of American national security officials to use human beings as experimental guinea pigs. This was already going on with regard to the search for the truth serum and some of the mind control techniques incorporated under Project Bluebird and Operation Artichoke, the project we're about to examine. However, even at this early stage, using people as human guinea pigs resulted in a problem. Namely, what do you do with the guinea pigs after the experiment is over? The various contingencies derived by the intelligence services and CIA were discussed in Acid Dreams as follows. In a footnote to the passage we just read, obtaining information was only one aspect of the interrogation process. Even when CIA officers were able to loosen a subject's tongue, other problems remained, such as how to ensure that he would not remember the events that transpired during his stint in the Twilight Zone. Quote, if by some means we could create a perfect and thoroughly controlled amnesia, a CIA agent declared, the matter would be simplified. But amnesia is not certain and cannot be guaranteed. Certain drugs were known to produce amnesia for a matter of hours or days, but this was not sufficient. The CIA also had access to chemicals capable of causing permanent brain damage, but long-term amnesia drugs that would be completely reversible over a 12 to 18 month period were not available. This was quite an inconvenience as far as the national security experts were concerned. The question of what to do with subjects of special interrogation sessions, the disposal problem, unquote, provoked a heated debate inside the company. The immediate objective was to find a way of holding them, quote, in maximum custody until either operations have progressed to the point where their knowledge is no longer highly sensitive, or the knowledge they possess in general will be of no use to the enemy, unquote. One possibility suggested in CIA documents was to render a person incoherent through psychological and or pharmacological attack, and then have him placed in a mental institution. An unspecified number of subjects were committed involuntarily to insane asylums, including some who were described in CIA memoranda as mentally sound. This practice, which began in the early 1950s and continued at least until the mid-1960s, invites obvious comparisons to the incarceration of Russian dissidents in psychiatric hospitals because of their political views. Another option involved termination with extreme prejudice, unquote, CIA lingo for assassination, but this was hardly an ideal solution in all situations. In one CIA document, the question of disposal was discussed under the heading Lobotomy and Related Operations. A number of individuals who were fully cognizant of the disposal problem suggested that lobotomy, quote, might be the answer or at least a partial solution, unquote. They argued that lobotomy would create a person, quote, who no longer cared, unquote, who had lost all initiative and drive, whose allegiance to ideal or motivating factors no longer existed, and who would probably have, if not complete amnesia, at least a fuzzy or spotty memory for recent and past events. They also pointed out, quote, that certain lobotomy types of operations were simple, quickly performed, and not too dangerous, unquote. Along this line, a group of CIA scientists entertained the possibility of using an ice pick lobotomy to render an individual harmless, quote, from a security point of view, unquote. A memo dated February 7, 1952, notes that on numerous occasions after using electroshock to produce anesthesia, an unidentified surgeon in the Washington, D.C. area performed an operation that involved destroying brain tissue by piercing the skull just above the eye with a fine surgical ice pick. This type of psychosurgery had certain advantages in that it resulted in nervous, confusional, and amnesia effects, unquote, without leaving a telltale scar, unquote. The CIA also experimented with brain surgery via UHF sound waves, and at one point during the early 1950s attempted to create a microwave amnesia beam that would destroy memory neurons. Not all CIA officials, however, favored using lobotomy as a disposal technique. Potential drawbacks were cited. Surgical risk was great, brain damage could be extensive, and such an operation, if faulty, could produce a vegetable, unquote. Moreover, if the enemy discovered that the CIA was mutilating people's brains for the sake of national security, this information could be exploited as a propaganda weapon. Other CIA officials opposed lobotomy because it was blatantly inhumane and violated all concepts of fair play and the American way of life, and thus it could never be officially sanctioned or supported. A CIA document dated March 3, 1952 states that, quote, while the USSR and its satellites are capable of any conceivable atrocity against human beings to attain what they think are their ends, we should not, with our high regard for human life, use these techniques unless by using them we save the lives of our own people and the situation is highly critical to the nation's safety. The ambiguous wording of that last sentence is something to mull over. The major point of this footnote being that with the inclination towards unwitting human experimentation that stemmed from the CIA's mind control operations, and which in turn gained impetus, as I said, from the Third Reich alumni that we brought in at the end of the war, a, quote, disposal problem arose. And I think some of the ethical tangles of the entire LSD program are themselves exposed and highlighted rather nicely by this problem. Aficionados of the underground television series The Prisoner may want to think about this some too, because as that series would indicate, that at least on certain occasions art imitates life. Indeed, and as Dave made the point, it's very important to realize that a lot of the direct information that initially went into the CIA's mind control, interrogation, and later behavioral control investigations came directly out of the records of people like Dr. Hubertus
Struchold in Dachau, and Struchold, who of course then later was brought into the United States and feted with all sorts of honors and called father of the space program, along with Werner von Braun and Walter K. Dornberger, a couple of other real princes who, among other things, in the prison camp that served as their workshop, used to string people up on wires as an example to other prisoners. But Struchold used to do things like injecting people with gasoline, shooting them to see how quickly the wounds would congeal under certain types of conditions, freezing them to death in ice cold water, and all kinds of stuff. This is one of the fathers of our space program. With this as an example, and these people being regarded as useful and worthwhile influences for the CIA to bring into the United States, it's very little surprise that a little later on in the program that the CIA wouldn't find any ethical problems with jamming an ice pick into somebody's brain because they were a security problem. Again, an innocent human volunteer, not a Soviet spy.
This is by way of showing not only the early progress of the mind control programs of the CIA, which gave direct rise to the LSD phenomenon in the United States, but by way of showing the moral and historical background to the LSD phenomenon. As we will repeat later in the broadcast, if this is your idea of peace and love, I'd hate to see your idea of hate and war.
Continuing with Acid Dreams, from a section labeled Enter LSD. It was with the hope of finding the long-sought miracle drug that CIA investigators first began to dabble with LSD-25 in the early 1950s. At the time, very little was known about the hallucinogen, even in scientific circles. Dr. Werner Stoll, the son of Sandow's president Arthur Stoll and a colleague of Albert Hofmann's, was the first person to investigate the psychological properties of LSD. The results of his study were presented in the Swiss Archives of Neurology in 1947. Stoll reported that LSD produced disturbances in perception, hallucinations, and acceleration in thinking. Moreover, the drug was found to blunt the usual suspiciousness of schizophrenic patients. No unfavorable after effects were described. 2 years later, in the same journal, Stoll contributed a second report entitled, quote, "A new hallucinatory agent active in very small amounts," unquote. The fact that LSD caused hallucinations should not have been a total surprise to the scientific community. Sandoz first became interested in ergot, ERGOT, the natural source of lysergic acid, because of numerous stories passed down through the ages. The rye fungus had a mysterious, it's rye, R-Y-E, not W-R-Y. They're not anthropomorphizing it. The rye fungus had a mysterious and contradictory reputation. In China and parts of the Mideast, it was thought to possess medicinal qualities, and certain scholars believe that it may have been used in sacred rites in ancient Greece. In other parts of Europe, however, the same fungus was associated with the horrible malady known as St. Anthony's fire, which struck periodically like the plague. Medieval chronicles tell of villages and towns where nearly everyone went mad for a few days after ergot-diseased rye was unknowingly milled into flour and baked as bread. Men were afflicted with gangrenous limbs that looked like blackened stumps, and pregnant women miscarried. Even in modern times, there have been reports of ergot-related epidemics. The CIA inherited this ambiguous legacy when it embraced LSD as a mind-controlled drug. An Artichoke document, Operation Artichoke, by the way, was another CIA mind control program coming out of Operation Bluebird. An Artichoke document, dated October 21st, 1951, indicates that acid was tested initially as part of a pilot study of the effects of various chemicals, quote, on the conscious suppression of experimental or non-threat secrets. In addition to lysergic acid, this particular survey covered a wide range of substances, including morphine, ether, benzodrine, ethyl alcohol, and mescaline. Quote, "There is no question," noted the author of this report, "that drugs are already on hand, and new ones are being produced, that can destroy integrity and make indiscreet the most dependable individual." The report concluded by recommending that LSD be critically tested, quote, "under threat conditions beyond the scope of civilian experimentation," unquote. POWs, federal prisoners, and security officers were mentioned as possible candidates for these field experiments. In another study, designed to ascertain optimal dosage levels for interrogation sessions, a CIA psychiatrist administered LSD to, quote, "at least 12 human subjects of not too high mentality," unquote. At the outset, the subjects were, quote, told only that a new drug was being tested and promised that nothing serious or dangerous would happen to them. During the intoxication, they realized something was happening, but were never told exactly what, unquote. A dosage range of 100 to 150 micrograms was finally selected, and the agency proceeded to test the drug in mock interrogation trials. Initial reports seemed promising. In one instance, LSD was given to an officer who had been instructed not to reveal, quote, a significant military secret. When questioned, however, quote, he gave all the details of the secret, and after the effects of the LSD had worn off, the officer had no knowledge of revealing the information. Complete amnesia, unquote. Favorable reports kept coming in, and when this phase of experimentation was completed, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, OSI, prepared a lengthy memorandum entitled Potential New Agent for Unconventional Warfare. LSD was said to be useful, quote, for eliciting true and accurate statements from subjects under its influence during interrogation, unquote. Moreover, the data on hand suggested that LSD might help in reviving memories of past experiences.
Now, the next section of acid dreams that we're going to look at underscores the manner in which it was the very research which we now see being in our historical retrospective here, which we see being undertaken in the early 1950s under the auspices of Operation Artichoke, that it was the push to develop this mind control and ostensibly, at least, or initially, truth serum drug, which was what the CIA was looking for with LSD. This is what brought the LSD research into our society. Initially, there was almost no one doing LSD research, and the very research programs that we're talking about here was what brought LSD into American society. Again, hardly anybody was doing anything one way or the other with LSD as a result of the CIA's programs to test this drug as a possible truth serum, mind control drug, and what have you. LSD became a major asset to American, not asset, but a major adjunct to American psychological research. We're going to take a look at that now, the experimentation programs undertaken on human subjects, and the manner in which, literally, LSD came from the CIA. Returning to acid dreams. When the CIA first became interested in LSD, only a handful of scientists in the United States were engaged in hallucinogenic drug research. At the time, there was little private or public support for this relatively new field of experimental psychiatry, and no one had undertaken a systematic investigation of LSD. The CIA's mind control specialists sensed a golden opportunity in the making. With a sizable treasure chest at their disposal, they were in a position to boost the careers of scientists whose skill and expertise would be of maximum benefit to the CIA. Almost overnight, a whole new market for grants in LSD research sprang into existence as money started pouring through CIA-linked conduits or cutouts such as the Geschichter Fund for Medical Research, the Society for the Study of Human Ecology, and the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation. Among those who benefited from the CIA's largesse was Dr. Max Rinkel, R-I-N-K-E-L, the first person to bring LSD to the United States. In 1949, Rinkel, a research psychiatrist, obtained a supply of LSD from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland and gave the drug to his partner, Dr. Robert Hyde, who took the first acid trip in the Western Hemisphere. Rinkel and Hyde went on to organize an LSD study at the Boston Psychopathic Institute, a pioneering mental health clinic affiliated with Harvard University. They tested the drug on 100 volunteers and reported the initial findings in May of 1950, nearly 3 years before the CIA began funding their work, at the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association. Rinkel announced that LSD produced, quote, a transitory psychotic disturbance, unquote, in normal subjects. This was highly significant, for it raised the possibility that mental disorders could be studied objectively in a controlled experimental setting. Rinkel's hypothesis was supported and expanded upon during the same forum by Dr. Paul Hoch, or Hoch, H-O-C-H, a prominent psychiatrist who would also proffer his services to the CIA in the years ahead. Hoch reported that the symptoms produced by LSD, mescaline, and related drugs were similar to those of schizophrenia. Intensity of color perception, hallucinations, depersonalization, intense anxiety, paranoia, and in some cases catatonic manifestations. As Hoch put it, quote, LSD and mescaline disorganized the psychic integration of the individual, unquote. He believed that the medical profession was fortunate to have access to these substances, for now it would be possible to reconstruct temporary or model psychoses in the laboratory. LSD was considered an exceptional research tool in that the subject could provide a detailed description of his experience while he was under the influence of the drug. It was hoped that careful analysis of these data would shed new light on schizophrenia and other enigmatic mental diseases. Hoch's landmark thesis, that LSD was a psychotomimetic or madness-mimicking agent, caused a sensation in scientific circles and led to several important and stimulating theories regarding the biochemical basis of schizophrenia. This, in turn, sparked an upsurge of interest in brain chemistry and opened new vistas in the field of experimental psychiatry. In light of the extremely high potency of LSD, it seemed completely plausible that infinitesimal traces of a psychoactive substance produced through metabolic dysfunction by the human organism might cause psychotic disturbances. Conversely, attempts to alleviate a lysergic psychosis, unquote, might point the way toward curing schizophrenia and other forms of mental illness. As it turned out, the model psychosis concept dovetailed particularly well with the secret schemes of the CIA, which also viewed LSD in terms of its ability to blow minds and make people crazy. Thus, it is not surprising that the CIA chose to invest in men like Rinkel and Hoch. Most scientists were flattered by the government's interest in their research, and they were eager to assist the CIA in its attempts to unravel the riddle of LSD. This was, after all, the Cold War, and one did not have to be a blue-ribbon hawk or a hardliner to work in tandem with American intelligence. In the early 1950s, the CIA approached Dr. Nick Bercel, B-E-R-C-E-L, a psychiatrist who maintained a private practice in Los Angeles. Bercel was one of the first people in the United States to work with LSD, and the CIA asked him to consider a haunting proposition. What would happen if the Russians put LSD in the water supply of a large American city? A skillful saboteur could carry enough acid in his coat pocket to turn an entire metropolis into a loony bin, assuming he found a way to distribute it equally. In light of this frightening prospect, would Bercel render a patriotic service by calculating exactly how much LSD would be required to contaminate the water supply of Los Angeles? Bercel consented, and that evening he dissolved a tiny amount of acid in a glass of tap water, only to discover that the chlorine neutralized the drug. "Don't worry," he told his CIA contact, "it won't work." Remember this scenario of dosing American reservoirs later. We're going to come in contact with an interesting proposition by Timothy Leary in that regard.
Another interesting proposition right here is the fact that the CIA presented it apparently to Dr. Bercel as being something they were worried that a Soviet saboteur might do, and when he told them it wouldn't work, well, we'll see. Continuing, the agency took this as a mandate, and another version of LSD was eventually concocted to overcome this drawback. A CIA document states accordingly, quote, "If the concept of contaminating a city's water supply seems, or in actual fact is found to be far-fetched, this is by no means certain, there is still the possibility of contaminating, say, the water supply of a bomber base, or, more easily still, that of a battleship. Our current work contains the strong suggestion that LSD-25 will produce hysteria, unaccountable laughing, anxiety, terror. It requires little imagination to realize what the consequences might be if a battleship's crew were so affected," unquote. The CIA never got in touch with Bercel again, but they monitored his research reports in various medical journals. When Bercel gave LSD to spiders, they spun perfectly symmetrical webs. Animal studies also showed that cats cringed before untreated mice, and fish that normally swam close to the bottom of a water tank hovered near the top. In another experiment, Dr. Louis Jolly West, chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oklahoma, injected an elephant with a massive dose of 300,000 micrograms. Dr. West, a CIA contract employee and an avid believer in the notion that hallucinogens were psychotomimetic agents, was trying to duplicate the periodic, quote, rut madness that overtakes male elephants for about 1 week each year. But the animal did not experience a model elephant psychosis. It just keeled over and remained in a motionless stupor. In attempting to revive the elephant, West administered a combination of drugs that ended up killing the poor beast. Research on human subjects showed that LSD lodged primarily in the liver, spleen, and kidneys. Only a tiny amount, 0.01% of the original dose, entered the brain, and it only remained there for 20 minutes. This was a most curious finding, as the effect of LSD was not evident until the drug had disappeared entirely from the central nervous system. Some scientists thought that LSD might act as a trigger mechanism, releasing or inhibiting a naturally occurring substance in the brain, but no one could figure out exactly why the drug had such a dramatic effect on the mind. Many other questions were in need of clarification. Could the drug be fatal? Well, parenthetically, obviously it could to elephants anyway. What was the maximum dose? Were the effects constant, or were there variations according to different personality types? Could the reaction be accentuated by combining LSD with other chemicals? Was there an antidote? Some of these questions overlapped with legitimate medical concerns, and researchers on CIA stipends published unclassified versions of their work in prestigious scientific periodicals. But these accounts omitted secret data given to the CIA on how LSD affected, quote, operationally pertinent categories, such as disturbance of memory, alteration of sex patterns, eliciting information, increasing suggestibility, and creating emotional dependence.
Continuing.
We actually, if we're going to try and get a 45-minute break for people to flip tapes, we should probably do it now.
Oh, okay. Why don't we read one more section here,
okay.
and then we'll give them a chance to. Continuing with acid dreams. The CIA was particularly interested in psychiatric reports suggesting that LSD could break down familiar behavior patterns, for this raised the possibility of reprogramming or brainwashing. If LSD temporarily altered a person's view of the world and suspended his belief system, CIA doctors surmised, then perhaps Russian spies could be cajoled into switching loyalties while they were tripping. This brainwashing strategy was relatively simple. Find the subject's weakest point, his squeaky board, unquote, and bear down on it. Use any combination or synthesis which might, quote, open the mind to the power of suggestion to a degree never hitherto dreamed possible, unquote. LSD would be employed to provoke a reality shift, to break someone down and tame him, to find a locus of anonymity and leave a mark there forever. To explore the feasibility of this approach, the agency turned to Dr. Ewan Cameron, C-A-M-E-R-O-N, a respected psychiatrist who served as president of the Canadian, the American, and the World Psychiatric Associations before his death in 1967. Cameron also directed the Alain Memorial Institute at Montreal's McGill University, where he developed a bizarre and unorthodox method for treating schizophrenia. With financial backing from the CIA, he tested his method on 53 patients at Alain, or Elaine, A-L-L-A-I-N. The so-called treatment started with sleep therapy, unquote, in which subjects were knocked out for months at a time. The next phase, de-patterning, entailed massive electroshock and frequent doses of LSD designed to wipe out past behavior patterns. Then Cameron tried to recondition the mind through a technique known as psychic driving, unquote. The patients, once again heavily sedated, were confined to sleep rooms, unquote, where tape-recorded messages played over and over from speakers under their pillows. Some heard the same message 250,000 times. Cameron's methods were later discredited, and the CIA grudgingly gave up the notion of LSD as a brainwashing technique. But that was little consolation to those who served as guinea pigs for the CIA's secret mind control projects. 9 of Cameron's former patients have sued the American government for $1 million each, claiming that they are still suffering from the trauma they went through at Elaine. These people never agreed to participate in a scientific experiment, a fact which reflects little credit on the CIA, even if agency officials feared that the Soviets were spurting ahead in the mind control race. The CIA violated the Nuremberg Code for Medical Ethics by sponsoring experiments on unwitting subjects. Ironically, Dr. Cameron was a member of the Nuremberg Tribunal that heard the case against Nazi war criminals who committed atrocities during World War II. Like the Nazi doctors at Dachau, the CIA victimized certain groups of people who were unable to resist: prisoners, mental patients, foreigners, the terminally ill, sexual deviants, and ethnic minorities. One project took place at the Addiction Research Center of the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. Lexington was ostensibly a place where heroin addicts could go to shake a habit, and although it was officially a penitentiary, all the inmates were referred to as patients. The patients had their own way of referring to the doctors, hacks, or croakers, unquote, who patrolled the premises in military uniforms. The patients at Lexington had no way of knowing that it was one of 15 penal and mental institutions utilized by the CIA in its super-secret drug development program. To conceal its role, the agency enlisted the aid of the Navy and the National Institutes of Mental Health, which served as conduits for channeling money to Dr. Harris Isbell, I-S-B-E-L-L, a gung-ho research scientist who remained on the CIA payroll for over a decade. According to CIA documents, the directors of NIMH and the National Institutes of Health were fully cognizant of the agency's interest in Isbell's work and offered full support and protection, unquote. When the CIA came across a new drug, usually supplied by American pharmaceutical firms that needed testing, they frequently sent it over to their chief doctor at Lexington, where an ample supply of captive guinea pigs was readily available. Over 800 compounds were farmed out to Isbell, including LSD and a variety of hallucinogens. It became an open secret among street junkies that if the supply got tight, you could always commit yourself to Lexington, where heroin and morphine were doled out as payment if you volunteered for Isbell's wacky drug experiments. Small wonder that Lexington had a return rate of 90%. Dr. Isbell, a long-time member of the Food and Drug Administration's Advisory Committee on the Abuse of Depressant and Stimulant Drugs, defended the volunteer system on the grounds that there was no precedent at the time for offering inmates cash for their services.
Okay, when we come back from a short break, we are going to be reading a little bit more about Dr. Isbell's CIA-funded and assisted experiments, and we're going to be talking more about the formation of the CIA's concept of LSD as a behavior control substance, even more than an interrogation technique.
For people who eventually hear this program via a rebroadcast, or for people who listen to it on tape, that will continue on the second side of this particular cassette series.
This is Nip Tuck. Dave Emory and I will be back with more of Radio Free America, number 28, in just a few minutes, right here on KF. We're reading and we're talking at this moment about the CIA-subsidized experiments of a gentleman by the name of Dr. Isbell, I-S-B-E-L-L.
Recall now, he was administering LSD under all kinds of strange conditions to inmates, people who were trying to get themselves cured of drug addiction. As a matter of fact, that it basically would amounted almost to an outpatient treatment center in Lexington, Massachusetts.
Kentucky.
Lexington, Kentucky, rather. These were people that were trying to get off drugs, and so what Dr. Isbell, with his CIA-financed research, was doing was administering large quantities of LSD to them. The irony of that, I don't think, needs to be underscored any further.
And then paying them off with heroin and morphine for going through the LSD experience. So,
well, just as long as he was fair.
Yeah, a real prince, a real. Anyway, we're going to go on. We're going to continue with Acid Dreams, talking about the experiments and well, we'll let it speak for itself. CIA documents describe experiments conducted by Isbell, this of course Dr. Harris Isbell, Lexington, Kentucky, in which certain patients, nearly all black inmates, were given LSD for more than 75 consecutive days. In order to overcome tolerance to the hallucinogen, Isbell administered, quote, double, triple, and quadruple doses. A report dated May 5, 1959, comments on experiments involving psilocybin, a semi-synthetic version of the magic mushroom. Subjects who ingested the drug became extremely anxious, although sometimes there were periods of intense elation marked by, quote, continuous gales of laughter. A few patients felt that, quote, they had become very large or had shrunk to the size of children. Their hands or feet did not seem to be their own and sometimes took on the appearance of animal paws. They reported many fantasies or dreamlike states in which they seemed to be elsewhere. Fantastic experiences, such as trips to the moon or living in gorgeous castles, were occasionally reported, unquote. Isbell concluded, quote, despite these striking subjective experiences, the patients remained oriented in time, place, and person. In most instances, the patients did not lose their insight, but realized that the effects were due to the drug. 2 of the 9 patients, however, did lose insight and felt that their experiences were caused by the experimenters controlling their minds, unquote. In addition to his role as a research scientist, Dr. Isbell served as a go-between for the CIA in its attempts to obtain drug samples from European pharmaceutical concerns, which assumed they were providing medicine to a U.S. public health official. The CIA, in turn, acted as a research coordinator, passing information, tips, and leads to Isbell and its other contract employees so that they could keep abreast of each other's progress. When a new discovery was made, the CIA would often ask another researcher to conduct a follow-up study for confirmation. One scientist whose work was coordinated with Isbell's in such a manner was Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, P-F-E-I-F-F-E-R, a noted pharmacologist from Princeton who tested LSD on inmates at the federal prison in Atlanta and the Bordentown Reformatory in New Jersey. Isbell, Pfeiffer, Cameron, West, and Hoke all were part of a network of doctors and scientists who gathered intelligence for the CIA. Through these scholar informants, the agency stayed on top of the latest developments within the, quote, above-ground LSD scene, which expanded rapidly during the Cold War.
Now, as indicated in the first section of the broadcast, the use of LSD by American psychological research organizations and individuals was spurred by this CIA domestic funding. Now, we're going to look at the next major stage of the CIA's LSD testing, in which not only were people tested without being told precisely what was going to be done to them, but people were tested in an outside or street contexts. In other words, no longer was this being done inside of mental and penal institutions. This was being done out on the streets of America, and it's at this point, and we're going to take a look at this street testing, so to speak, again, of unwitting human subjects, this under the CIA's MKUltra program. It was in the course of the MKUltra program that eventually the LSD rather, spread to the society as a whole. Continuing with acid dreams. In a speech before the National Alumni Conference at Princeton University on April 10, 1953, newly appointed CIA Director Allen Dulles lectured his audience on, quote, how the sinister battle for men's minds had become in Soviet hands, unquote. The human mind, Dulles warned, was a malleable tool, and the Red Menace had secretly developed brain perversion techniques. Some of these methods were so subtle and so abhorrent to our way of life that we have recoiled from facing up to them. Dulles continued, the minds of selected individuals who are subjected to such treatment are deprived of the ability to state their own thoughts. Parrot-like, the individuals so conditioned can merely repeat the thoughts which have been implanted in their minds by suggestions from outside. In effect, the brain becomes a phonograph, playing a disc put on its spindle by an outside genius over which it has no control, unquote. 3 days after delivering this address, Dulles authorized Operation MKUltra, the CIA's major drug and mind control program during the Cold War. MKUltra was the brainchild of Richard Helms, a high-ranking member of the clandestine services, otherwise known as the Dirty Tricks Department, who championed such methods throughout his career as an intelligence officer. As Helms explained to Dulles when he first proposed the MKUltra project, aside from the offensive potential, the development of a comprehensive capability in this field gives us a thorough knowledge of the enemy's theoretical potential, thus enabling us to defend ourselves against a foe who might not be as restrained in the use of these techniques as we are, unquote. The super-secret MKUltra program was run by a relatively small unit within the CIA known as the Technical Services Staff, or TSS. Originally established as a supplementary funding mechanism to the Artichoke Project, MKUltra quickly grew into a mammoth undertaking that outflanked earlier mind control initiatives.
And those of you who are prone to a black sense of humor will have to probably refrain from some dark chuckles over Allen Dulles talking about the brain perversion techniques and the sinister Soviets while the CIA was jamming ice picks into people's brains to keep them from talking about the experiments that had been done to them. Continuing in acid dreams. Incidents such as this...
Oh, by the way, the authors are talking about human experimentation on subjects.
Yes, this is a CIA operative himself who had a very, very bad experience on LSD. Incidents such as these reaffirmed to the MKUltra crew just how devastating a weapon LSD could be. But this only made them more enthusiastic about the drug. They kept springing it on people in a manner reminiscent of the ritual hazing of fraternity pledges. Quote, "It was just too damned informal," a TSS officer later said. "We didn't know much. We were playing around in ignorance. We were just naive about what we were doing." Such pranks claimed their first victim in November 1953, when a group of CIA and Army technicians gathered for a 3-day work retreat at a remote hunting lodge in the backwoods of Maryland. On the second day of the meeting, Dr. Gottlieb spiked the after-dinner cocktails with LSD. As the drug began to take effect, Gottlieb told everyone that they had ingested a mind-altering chemical. By that time, the group had become boisterous with laughter and unable to carry on a coherent conversation. One man was not amused by the unexpected turn of events. Dr. Frank Olson, an Army scientist who specialized in biological warfare research, had never taken LSD before, and he slid into a deep depression. His mood did not lighten when the conference adjourned. Normally a gregarious family man, Olson returned home quiet and withdrawn. When he went to work after the weekend, he asked his boss to fire him because he had, quote, messed up the experiment during the retreat. Alarmed by his erratic behavior, Olson's superiors contacted the CIA, which sent him to New York to see Dr. Harold Abramson. A respected physician, Abramson taught at Columbia University and was chief of the allergy clinic at Mount Sinai Hospital. He was also one of the CIA's principal LSD researchers and a part-time consultant to the Army Chemical Corps. While these were impressive credentials, Abramson was not a trained psychiatrist, and it was this kind of counseling his patient desperately needed. For the next few weeks, Olson confided his deepest fears to Abramson. He claimed the CIA was putting something in his coffee to make him stay awake at night. He said people were plotting against him, and he heard voices at odd hours commanding him to throw away his wallet, which he did, even though it contained several uncashed checks. Dr. Abramson concluded that Olson was mired in, quote, a psychotic state with delusions of persecution that had been, quote, crystallized by the LSD experience. Arrangements were made to move him to Chestnut Lodge, a sanatorium in Rockville, Maryland, staffed by CIA-cleared psychiatrists. Apparently other CIA personnel who suffered from psychiatric disorders were enrolled in this institution. On his last evening in New York, Olson checked into a room at the Statler Hilton along with a CIA agent assigned to watch him. And then, in the wee hours of the morning, the troubled scientist plunged headlong through a closed window to his death 10 floors below.
Continuing with acid dreams, the Olson suicide had immediate repercussions within the CIA. An elaborate cover-up erased clues to the actual circumstances leading up to his death. Olson's widow was eventually given a government pension, and the full truth of what happened would not be revealed for another 20 years. Meanwhile, CIA Director Allen Dulles suspended the in-house testing program for a brief period while an internal investigation was conducted. In the end, Gottlieb and his team received only a mildly worded reprimand for exercising bad judgment, unquote, but no records of the incident were kept in their personnel files which would harm their future careers. The importance of LSD eclipsed all other considerations, and the secret acid tests resumed. Gottlieb was now ready to undertake the final and most daring phase of the MKUltra program. LSD would be given to unwitting targets in real-life situations. But who would actually do the dirty work? While looking through some old OSS files, Gottlieb discovered that marijuana had been tested on unsuspecting subjects in an effort to develop a truth serum. These experiments had been organized by George Hunter White, a tough, old-fashioned narcotics officer who ran a training school for American spies during World War II. Perhaps White would be interested in testing drugs for the CIA. As a matter of protocol, Gottlieb first approached Harry Anslinger, chief of the Federal Narcotics Bureau. Anslinger was favorably disposed and agreed to lend, unquote, one of his top men to the CIA on a part-time basis. Right from the start, White had plenty of leeway in running his operations. He rented an apartment in New York's Greenwich Village, and with funds supplied by the CIA, he transformed it into a safe house complete with two-way mirrors, surveillance equipment, and the like. Posing as an artist and a seaman, White lured people back to his pad and slipped them drugs. A clue as to how his subjects fared can be found in White's personal diary, which contains passing references to surprise LSD experiments. Quote, Gloria gets horrors, Janet sky high, unquote. The frequency of bad reactions prompted White to coin his own word for the drug, stormy, which was how he referred to LSD throughout his 14-year stint as a CIA operative. In 1955, White was transferred to San Francisco, where 2 more safe houses were established. During this period, he initiated Operation Midnight Climax, in which drug-addicted prostitutes were hired to pick men up from local bars and bring them back to a CIA-financed bordello. Unknowing customers were treated to drinks laced with LSD while White sat on a portable toilet behind a two-way mirror, sipping martinis and watching every stoned and kinky moment. As payment for their services, the hookers received $100 a night, plus a guarantee from White that he'd intercede on their behalf should they be arrested while plying their trade. In addition to providing data about LSD, Midnight Climax enabled the CIA to learn about the sexual proclivities of those who passed through the safe houses. White's harem of prostitutes became the focal point of an extensive CIA study of how to exploit the art of lovemaking for espionage purposes. So again, Under the MKULTRA program, the LSD testing by the CIA moves from penal and mental institutions to street situations. And as we're going to take a look now, as we begin looking at what the authors Lee and Schlein refer to as psychedelic pioneers, in other words, the LSD proselytizers, people who were responsible for the growing cultural popularity of LSD, we're going to find as we, so to speak, swing the camera away from some of the main figures involved in LSD proselytization, and we're going to find many of the same people involved in the CIA's mind control programs, and specifically in the LSD testing on various human subjects. Well, as I say, when we turn the camera away from these psychedelic proselytizers, we always find the key figures in the CIA's programs just off camera, I guess you could say, just waiting in the wings.
All right, now we're going to talk about, as Dave put, one of these psychedelic pioneers, as Lee and Schlein term him. They also call him the original Captain Trips.
This is, although most people usually associate names like Tim Leary and Ken Kesey, both of whom we're going to talk about, the original LSD proselytizer was a man named Captain Alfred M. Hubbard, and where the Captain moniker comes from, we will find out right now.
The stout, crew-cut figure riding in the Rolls-Royce was a mystery to those who knew him. A spy by profession, he lived a life of intrigue and adventure befitting his chosen career. Born dirt poor in Kentucky, he served with the OSS during the Second World War and went on to make a fortune as a uranium entrepreneur. His prestigious government and business connections read like a who's who of the power elite in North America. His name was Captain Alfred M. Hubbard. His friends called him Cappy, and he was known as the Johnny Appleseed of LSD. The blustery, rum-drinking Hubbard is widely credited with being the first person to emphasize LSD's potential as a visionary or transcendental drug. His faith in the LSD revelation was such that he made it his life's mission to turn on as many men and women as possible. Quote, "Most people are walking in their sleep," he said. "Turn them around, start them in the opposite direction, and they wouldn't even know the difference." But there was a quick way to remedy that. Give them a good dose of LSD and, quote, "let them see themselves for what they are." That Hubbard, of all people, should have emerged as the first genuine LSD apostle is all the more curious in light of his long-standing affiliation with the cloak and dagger trade. Indeed, he was no run-of-the-mill spook. As a high-level OSS officer, the captain directed an extremely sensitive covert operation that involved smuggling weapons and war material to Great Britain prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. In pitch darkness, he sailed ships without lights up the coast of Vancouver, where they were refitted and used as destroyers by the British Navy. He also flew planes to the border, took them apart, towed the pieces into Canada, and sent them to England. These activities began with the quiet approval of President Roosevelt nearly a year and a half before the U.S. officially entered the war. To get around the neutrality snag, Hubbard became a Canadian citizen in a mock procedure. While based in Vancouver, where he later settled, he personally handled several $1 million filtered by the OSS through the American consulate to finance a multitude of covert operations in Europe. All this, of course, was highly illegal, and President Truman later issued a special pardon with kudos to the captain and his men. Not long after receiving this presidential commendation, Hubbard was introduced to LSD by Dr. Ronald Sandison of Great Britain. During his first acid trip in 1951, he claimed to have witnessed his own conception. Quote, "It was the deepest mystical thing I've ever seen," the captain recounted. "I saw myself as a tiny mite in a big swamp with a spark of intelligence. I saw my mother and father having intercourse. It was all clear."
Before we go on to analyze Hubbard's role in becoming the, quote, Johnny Appleseed of LSD, some more information about his background, continuing with acid dreams. After his legendary exploits with the OSS, the captain continued to serve as an undercover operative for various agencies within the U.S. government. He had many contacts with the FBI, for example, and he claimed to be a close friend of J. Edgar Hoover's. "That old bugger was tough, really tough," Hubbard said with admiration, but when he tried to turn on the FBI chief, Hoover stubbornly declined. However, the captain did manage to give the drug, quote, "to some top intelligence men in Washington, always with good results," unquote. During the early 1950s, Hubbard was asked to join the CIA, but he refused. "They lied so much, cheated so much, I don't like 'em," he snarled. They're lousy deceivers, sons of the devils themselves, unquote. The captain's beef with the agency stemmed in part from his unsuccessful attempt to secure back pay owed to him from his OSS days. They crooked me, he complained bitterly. As to whether or not his denials of working for CIA are to be taken at face value, listen to the following information. Hubbard was unkindly disposed toward the CIA for other reasons as well. Most important, he didn't approve of what the agency was doing with his beloved LSD. The CIA work stinks, he said. They were misusing it. I tried to tell them how to use it, but even when they were killing people, you couldn't tell them a goddamn thing. Hubbard was certain that Frank Olson was not the only person who died as a result of the CIA's surprise acid tests. I don't know how Al's Washington affairs were done, Dr. Osmond admitted. That's Dr. Humphrey Osmond, about whom we're going to read more in a second. He worked very closely with Al Hubbard. Resuming, I don't know how Al's Washington affairs were done, Dr. Osmond admitted. He was one of those naturally brilliant wheeler-dealers. Indeed, Hubbard seemed to have a knack for popping up in the most unpredictable places. He worked for the Treasury Department as a young man during the Capone days, busting moonshiners and gangsters who were smuggling liquor into the U.S. from Canada. Apparently, he was able to ingratiate himself with both sides during Prohibition, as he subsequently became Deputy Chief of Security for the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas. Those mafia men were always interesting to talk to, Hubbard remarked, but they never smiled, unquote. The captain also engaged in undercover work for a number of other government agencies, including the Federal Narcotics Bureau and the Food and Drug Administration, at a time when both organizations were assisting the CIA's drug testing programs. During the mid-1960s, he was employed by Teledyne, a major defense subcontractor, as, quote, Director of Human Factors Research, unquote. In this capacity, Hubbard served as advisor and consultant to a combined Navy and NASA project that involved testing the effects of psychochemical agents on a newly designed helicopter avionics system, unquote. Teledyne worked closely with various government organizations, including the CIA, to apply these techniques to additional areas of military interest. While Hubbard was not a CIA operative per se, his particular area of expertise, hallucinogenic drugs, brought him into close contact with elements of the espionage community. The CIA must have known what he was up to, since Sandoz and the FDA kept the agency informed whenever anyone received shipments of LSD. The captain, of course, was one of their best customers, having purchased large amounts of the drug on different occasions. So although as they indicated, it cannot be said that Al Hubbard was a CIA operative per se, he was a veteran, lifelong intelligence agent connected intimately with many different agencies of the U.S. national security establishment, and as we said, he was the Johnny Appleseed of LSD.
One of the interesting things about Cappy Hubbard, we're going to be reading a little bit more about him in a moment. One of the interesting things about Hubbard is that here is a man who claimed that LSD changed his entire life, that most people are walking through life in a daze, not understanding what's going on, and the thing that they need to do is to take LSD to change their perspective on things. Yet here's a man who took LSD in 1951 and still managed to work for all sorts of various government agencies involved in all kinds of military research and things of that nature. So as far as the common kind of cliche experience of people turning on to LSD and dropping out, it certainly didn't seem to affect Cappy Hubbard that way. He seemed, as a matter of fact, to continue even stronger, working for the government and for the defense establishment, and working in various things having to do with human factors research, quote unquote.
Now we're going to take a look at Hubbard's work with a civilian researcher named Dr. Humphrey Osmond, and civilian perhaps should be taken in quotes because he too had strong connections to the CIA's LSD research, although it cannot be said how aware he was of the source of his funding. But the point is, Al Hubbard and Dr. Humphrey Osmond became two of the pioneers of, quote, LSD therapy, unquote, and they in turn turned on a person who was to become one of the major proselytizers of the so-called psychedelic era, and one of the people whose literary work spurred a great many people to experiment with LSD and other hallucinogens, Aldous Huxley.
All right. Hubbard, then 49 years old, eagerly sought out others familiar with hallucinogenic drugs. He contacted Dr. Humphrey Osmond, a young British psychiatrist who was working with LSD and mescaline at Weyburn Hospital in Saskatchewan, Canada. Like most other researchers in the field, Osmond was primarily interested in psychosis and mental illness. In 1952, he shocked the medical world by drawing attention to the structural similarity between the mescaline and adrenaline molecules. implying that schizophrenia might be a form of self-intoxication caused by the body mistakenly producing its own hallucinogenic compounds. Osmond noted that mescaline enabled a normal person to see the world through the eyes of a schizophrenic, and he suggested that the drug be used as a tool for training doctors, nurses, and other hospital personnel to understand their patients from a more intimate perspective. Osmond's research attracted widespread attention within scientific circles. The CIA, ever intent on knowing the latest facts as early as possible, quickly sent informants to find out what was happening at Weyburn Hospital. Unbeknownst to Osmond and his cohorts, throughout the next decade they were contacted on repeated occasions by agency personnel. Indeed, it was impossible for an LSD researcher not to rub shoulders with the espionage establishment, for the CIA was monitoring the entire scene. I'm going to read that again, and then we're going to read a footnote that goes with it. Unbeknownst to Osmond and his cohorts, throughout the next decade they were contacted on repeated occasions by agency personnel. Indeed, it was impossible for an LSD researcher not to rub shoulders with the espionage establishment, for the CIA was monitoring the entire scene. Now, there's a footnote that goes with this talking a little bit more about some of Osmond's subsequent involvement. Osmond left Canada in 1963 and joined a group of researchers at the Princeton Neuropsychiatric Institute. There he worked closely with Dr. Bernard Aronson, whose studies in hypnosis and altered states of consciousness were funded by the CIA through the Society for the Study of Human Ecology. Osmond and Aronson later co-authored a popular anthology called Psychedelics. Unlike Aronson, who was unaware of the CIA's interest in his work, Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, another Princeton researcher, had close ties with the CIA. As one of Pfeiffer's associates put it, quote, "Princeton was crawling with agents. They came courting everyone. It was obvious. They would give us whatever we wanted. We realized we were being recruited, but at that time we were flattered that such a prestigious government agency was interested in us," unquote. A little too interested, perhaps, a number of scientists soon discovered that their mail was being opened and read by government agents.
And again, this is worth mentioning because Dr. Humphrey Osmond, along with Al Hubbard, the man he was working with here, became one of the people to strongly influence Aldous Huxley's turn in the direction of pro-psychedelic crusading.
All right, continuing back to the main body of the passage. Osmond's reports also caught the eye of Aldous Huxley, the eminent British novelist who for years had been preoccupied with the specter of drug-induced thought control. In 1931, Huxley wrote Brave New World, a futuristic vision of a totalitarian society in which the world controllers chemically coerced the population into loving its servitude. While Huxley grappled with the question of human freedom under pharmacological attack, he also recognized that certain drugs, particularly the hallucinogens, produced radical changes in consciousness that could have a profound and beneficial effect. Upon learning of Osmond's work, he decided to offer himself as a guinea pig. Huxley seemed like the perfect subject. A learned man steeped in many disciplines, he was also gifted with a writer's eloquence. Even if the drug confounded him, it would not tongue-tie him, for he was a glorious talker. But Osmond was still a bit apprehensive. Quote, "I did not relish the possibility, however remote, of being the man who drove Aldous Huxley mad," he explained. His worries proved to be unfounded. In May 1953, less than a month after the CIA initiated Operation MKUltra, Huxley tried mescaline for the first time at his home in Hollywood Hills, California, under Osmond's supervision. Quote, "It was, according to Huxley, without question the most extraordinary and significant experience this side of the beatific vision. Moreover, quote, it opens up a host of philosophical problems, throws intense light, and raises all manner of questions in the field of aesthetics, religion, theory of knowledge." Huxley described his mescaline adventure in the famous essay, The Doors of Perception, which took its title from the works of William Blake, the 18th century British poet and visionary artist. With this book, Huxley unabashedly declared himself a propagandist for hallucinogenic drugs, and for the first time a large segment of the educated public became aware of the existence of these substances. Not surprisingly, the treatise created a storm in literary circles. Some hailed it as a major intellectual statement, others dismissed it as pure quackery. Few critics realized that the book would have such an enormous impact in years to come.
So again, Aldous Huxley, whose book, the aforementioned Doors of Perception, was one of the pivotal motivators, I guess you could say, in terms of inclining people towards recreational hallucinogen use in the 60s, it should be noted that his introduction to psychedelic drugs came via Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who worked with Dr. Bernard Aronson on some of the CIA's LSD projects. And in turn, Humphrey Osmond and Al Hubbard, the people who, quote, turned on, so to speak, Aldous Huxley, are two of the people. Well, basically, Dr. Humphrey Osmond is heavily involved with Al Hubbard, who himself is an intelligence agent. And again, the point we're making here is that as we begin examining the cultural figures who were most responsible for the introduction of LSD into society as a recreational drug, when we move the camera off them, we find the CIA's LSD researchers and other intelligence people waiting in the wings. Of Aldous Huxley, the author of The Doors of Perception, and some of his other intelligence connections, we will examine a couple of interesting footnotes here in Acid Dreams. Of Huxley, the authors Schlane and Lee write, in his letters, Huxley mentioned, "My friend Dr. J. West," a reference to Jolly West, who conducted LSD studies for the CIA. At one point, while West was engaged in MKUltra research, Huxley suggested that he hypnotize his subjects prior to administering LSD in order to give them, quote, post-hypnotic suggestions aimed at orienting the drug-induced experience in some desired direction, unquote. Needless to say, the CIA was intrigued with this idea. Huxley also lectured on parapsychology at Duke University, where J.B. Rhine, R-H-I-N-E, with whom Huxley communicated, was engaged in ESP studies for the CIA and the Army. Well, Dr. Louis Joylin West, J-O-Y-L-O-N, was a person who we touched on briefly in the previous description of the CIA's early LSD research. He was the fellow who administered 300,000 micrograms to an elephant to see if he could simulate the rut madness, and then the elephant simply keeled over. Well, Louis Jolyon West, friend of Aldous Huxley, key CIA LSD researcher, is an interesting fellow. In another footnote, Lee and Schlane write, West was head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oklahoma during the 1950s and early 1960s, when he conducted research into LSD, hypnosis, and, quote, the psychobiology of dissociated states, unquote, for the CIA. It was West who administered a massive dose of LSD to an elephant as part of an ill-fated drug experiment. In 1964, he was called upon to examine Jack Ruby, who had murdered Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of President Kennedy. After visiting Ruby in his jail cell, West concluded that he had sunk into a, quote, paranoid state manifested by delusions, visual and auditory hallucinations, and suicidal impulses, unquote. Ruby was not faking these symptoms, West asserted, since he had vigorously rejected the doctor's repeated suggestions that he was mentally ill. Quote, the true malingerer usually grasps eagerly at such an explanation, said West. Since Ruby would not admit he was crazy, West concluded he was nuts. Catch-22. Ruby's delusions, unquote, included the belief that an ultra-right-wing conspiracy was behind the death of the president. On the basis of Dr. West's diagnosis, Ruby became a candidate for treatment of mental disorders. Another doctor soon put him on happy pills, unquote, although these drugs did not seem to cheer Ruby up. 2 years later, he died of cancer while still in prison. West, meanwhile, moved to Los Angeles, where he served as director of UCLA's Neuropsychiatric Institute, a position he still holds. In the early 1970s, he became embroiled in a heated controversy over plans for a Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence. Originally proposed by Governor Ronald Reagan, the Violence Center would have exceeded even Jack Ruby's worst paranoid nightmares had it not been scuttled by the California state legislature after information about it was leaked to the press. West, who helped formulate plans for the center, described the program as an attempt, quote, to predict the probability of occurrences, unquote, of violent behavior among specific population groups. The major known correlates of violence, according to West, are sex, male, age, youthful, ethnicity, black, and urbanicity, unquote. The Violence Center was to have been housed in a former military base located in a remote area of California. The medical facility at Vacaville Prison, the site of a major CIA drug testing program during the late 1960s and early 1970s, was listed among the facilities that would have been used to develop treatment models and implement pilot and demonstration programs for the Violence Center. Treatments discussed by West included chemical castration, psychosurgery, and the testing of experimental drugs on involuntarily incarcerated individuals. Furthermore, the activities of the center were to have been coordinated with a California law enforcement program that maintained computer files on pre-delinquent children so that they could be treated before they made a negative mark on society. Well, we've talked about a number of those different things in other archive shows. We talked about the UCLA study Center for the Study and Reduction of Violence in Radio Free America number 5, the first of our three-part series about mind control. We talked about Jack Ruby at great length in several of our Guns of November programs and others. Of course, his delusion that an ultra-right-wing conspiracy was behind the assassination of President Kennedy was about as delusional as the notion that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And it should be noted that at one point it was believed axiomatic that the sun revolved around the earth. The notion that Lee Harvey Oswald is a lone nut will hold about as much water as the geocentric theory, the geocentric theory of the solar system. The point is that Louis Jolyon West, a confidant, colleague, and personal friend of Aldous Huxley, who in turn was turned on to LSD by Humphrey Osmond and Al Hubbard. Hubbard, a lifelong intelligence agent. Humphrey Osmond, one of the CIA's LSD researchers. It's worth noting the connections of Aldous Huxley, and this is not to indict the man in terms of an overall human being, but his LSD, his psychedelic proselytization, and his experiences with the drug are, again, inseparable from the intelligence community.
Continuing with another section of Acid Dreams, they're talking here about, of course, Allen Ginsberg, the poet, but they're talking specifically about the experience they talk about as a bad trip that Allen Ginsberg had. The trip itself not so significant to it as how it came to be that Allen Ginsberg took the LSD in the first place. This became apparent to poet Allen Ginsberg when he took LSD for the first time at the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, California in 1959. Ginsberg was already familiar with psychedelic substances, having experimented with peyote on a number of occasions. As yet, however, there was no underground supply of LSD, and it was virtually impossible for lay folk to procure samples of the drug. Thus, he was pleased when Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist, put him in touch with a team of doctors in Palo Alto. Ginsberg had no way of knowing that one of the researchers associated with the institute, Dr. Charles Savage, had conducted hallucinogenic drug experiments for the U.S. Navy in the early 1950s. And we're going to read the footnote on Gregory Bateson. Formerly a member, remember this is the, quote, anthropologist, formerly a member of the Research and Analysis Branch of the OSS, Bateson was the husband and co-worker of anthropologist Margaret Mead. An exceptional intellect, he was turned on to acid by Dr. Harold Abramson, one of the CIA's chief LSD specialists. And Dr. Harold Abramson, of course, you heard that name already tonight because he was the man who was, quote, treating Frank Olson at the time that Frank Olson jumped out of a 10th floor hotel window.
Right. So, again, with regard to Allen Ginsberg, and he was another of the major LSD proselytizers during the 1960s and 70s, again, his introduction to the drug, again, is inseparable from the intelligence community and the CIA's use of LSD on unwitting civilian subjects, and obviously some witting civilian subjects as well. Palo Alto, where Allen Ginsberg was introduced to LSD via people whose introduction came from the CIA, was also the place where Ken Kesey, another famous LSD proselytizer, was introduced to the drug, and he too was introduced to the drug via the U.S. National Security Establishment. Kesey's introduction to LSD is described by the authors as follows. Nearly a decade before, Kesey was introduced to psychedelics as part of a government-funded drug study in Palo Alto. Oh, wait a minute, excuse me, I'm misreading that. Nearly a decade before Kesey was introduced to psychedelics as part of a government-funded drug study in Palo Alto, the CIA embarked upon a major effort to develop LSD into an effective mind control weapon. The CIA's behavior modification programs were geared toward domestic as well as foreign populations. Targets included selected individuals and large groups of people. So again, the VA hospital through which Ken Kesey was introduced to LSD was as a result of a government-funded study, and the Defense Department, as elsewhere described by these authors, was central to that.
Okay, now they're talking, Lee and Schlane are now talking about a man whose name is very familiar to all of us, that of Timothy Leary. And Timothy Leary, they're talking about, first had his introduction, or first heard about, or was intrigued by the prospects of LSD by an article by a man by the name of R. Gordon Wasson, who was a vice president of J.P. Morgan and Company. A lifelong, interest in mushrooms led him to try psilocybin, actually to try the mushrooms themselves. Psilocybin is the synthetic version of same, and to write about his experiences in Life magazine. Among those whose interest was piqued by Wasson's article in Life was a young professor named Timothy Leary. At the time of Wasson's groundbreaking explorations, Leary was pursuing a successful career as a clinical psychologist. Between 1954 and 1959, he was director of clinical research and psychology at the Kaiser Foundation Hospital in Oakland, California. He published extensively in scientific journals and established himself as a rising star in the field of behavioral psychology. He wrote a widely acclaimed psychology textbook and devised a personality test called the Leary, which was used by the CIA, among other organizations, to test prospective employees.
More about Timothy Leary's research at Harvard with initially psilocybin and eventually LSD. Leary returned to Harvard and established a psilocybin research project with the approval of Dr. Harry Murray, chairman of the Department of Social Relations. Dr. Murray, who ran the personality assessment section of the OSS during World War II, took a keen interest in Leary's work. He volunteered for a psilocybin session, becoming one of the first of many faculty and graduate students to sample the mushroom pill under Leary's guidance. Leary had obtained a supply from Sandoz, which distributed the new drug to researchers free of charge. So it's interesting that the departmental chairman under whom Tim Leary initially began his research into hallucinogenic compounds was himself a key OSS veteran, because many of the veterans of the OSS, even after its dissolution, continued to maintain contact with the old boy intelligence networks. Although not formally agents, they continued to associate with and occasionally work with members of the intelligence community. Exactly how the exact nature of the relationship between Dr. Harry Murray and Tim Leary is something that I think future research needs to shed light on.
Now, they're going on to talk about the early days of Leary's LSD experience, which were when he was at Harvard, and were mostly in conjunction with two other educators there, Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner, two of his associates. And there was a great deal of experimentation going on, a great deal of proselytization of the benefits of LSD as a sort of a purgative of the mind to get everybody out of their tired old ways of thinking. Not everyone was enchanted by the renegade psychedelic scene at Harvard. A confidential memorandum issued by the CIA's Office of Security, which had utilized LSD for interrogation purposes since the early 1950s, suggested that certain CIA-connected personnel might be involved with Leary's group. This prospect was disconcerting to security officials who considered hallucinogenic drugs, quote, extremely dangerous. Quote, uncontrolled experimentation has in the past resulted in tragic circumstances, and for this reason every effort is made to control any involvement with these drugs, unquote, a CIA agent reported. The document concluded with a specific directive. Quote, information concerning the use of this type of drug for experimental or personal reasons should be reported immediately. In addition, any information of agency personnel involved with Drs. Alpert or Leary, or with any other group engaged in this type of activity, should also be reported, unquote. It is known that during this period, Leary gave LSD to Mary Pinchot, Pinchot, a painter and a prominent Washington socialite who was married to Cord Meyer, a high-level CIA official. Meyer oversaw the CIA's infiltration of the U.S. National Student Association and the Congress for Cultural Freedom in Europe, which provided financial support to numerous Cold War liberal intellectuals and writers. Leary and Pinchot struck up a cordial friendship during her occasional visits to Cambridge in the early 1960s. She asked him to teach her how to guide an LSD session so she could introduce the drug to her circles in Washington. Quote, I have this friend who's a very important man, she confided to Leary. He's very impressed with what I've told him about my own LSD experience and what other people have told him. He wants to try it himself. Leary was intrigued, but Pinchot wouldn't tell him who she intended to turn on, nor did she inform her LSD mentor of her marriage to a CIA bigwig. Leary explained the basic rules about set and setting, emphasizing the importance of a comfortable, sensuous environment for an LSD trip. From time to time, Pinchot reported back to him. I can't give you all the details, she said, but top people in Washington are turning on. You'd be amazed at the sophistication of some of our leaders. We're getting a little group together. Leary had no way of knowing that Mary Pinchot was one of President Kennedy's girlfriends and that she and JFK smoked pot together in the White House. Pinchot was murdered less than a year after Kennedy was assassinated, and her diary disappeared from her home. When Leary learned of Pinchot's death, he recalled their conversations about LSD. At various times, she had hinted that the CIA was monitoring his activities. Since drug research is of vital importance to American intelligence, Pinchot told him that he'd be allowed to conduct his experiments as long as it didn't get out of hand. But Leary ignored her advice. In the spring of 1962, he published an article in the Journal of Atomic Scientists, warning that Russians might try to subvert the United States by dumping a few pounds of LSD into the water supply of major cities.
And of course, we've seen that notion was discounted sometime before with the research that was conducted where it was discovered that chlorine neutralized it, although the CIA at least developed another form of LSD that was not chlorine neutralizable, so to speak. The point here is that not only were there reports from the CIA themselves that apparently, quote, CIA-connected personnel might be involved with Leary's group, but as we've noticed, the wife of CIA official Cord Meyer, Mary Pinchot, or Pinchot Meyer, was involved with Tim Leary in terms of LSD experimentation. She also was involved with President Kennedy in terms of romantic dalliance. The point being here that Cord Meyer was a key CIA official. We talked about Cord Meyer, his interrelationship with the Washington Post crowd, and the death and probable assassination of Mary Pinchot in an archive show entitled Gloria in Excelsis, which details the interrelationship between the CIA, the women's movement, and the news media. And it's worth noting that the diary of Mary Pinchot disappeared after her murder. What's not mentioned here, but what is discussed in the archive show Gloria in Excelsis, is that it was CIA counterintelligence official and Knight of Malta James Angleton who destroyed it. And the possible connection between President Kennedy's assassination and the probable assassination of Mary Meyer. She was shot in such a way as strongly suggests that the robbery to which her killing was ascribed would probably, well, it was not that the case. She was shot once in the body and 2 times in the head. That's not the usual way that a robbery, someone shot during a robbery is eliminated. At any rate, the interrelationship between Leary, Mary Pinchot, Cord Meyer, the CIA, President Kennedy, Kennedy's assassination, and the probable assassination of Mary Meyer, political assassination that is something worth speculating about.
All right, and at this point we are going to take another break and give those of you out there taping a chance to turn it over. You are, of course, listening to Radio Free America number 28, and Dave Emory and myself, Nip Tuck, we will return in just a few minutes with more right here on KFJC. Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. But these studies, which involved animal as well as human subjects, did not yield an effective truth serum, and chatter was terminated in 1953. The Navy became interested in mescaline as an interrogation agent when American investigators learned of mind control experiments carried out by the Nazi doctors at the Dachau concentration camp during World War II. After administering the hallucinogen to 30 prisoners, the Nazis concluded that it was, quote, impossible to impose one's will on another person, as in hypnosis, even when the strongest dose of mescaline had been given, unquote. But the drug still afforded certain advantages to SS interrogators, who were consistently able to draw, quote, even the most intimate secrets from the subject when questions were cleverly put. Not surprisingly, quote, sentiments of hatred and revenge were exposed in every case, unquote. The mescaline experiments at Dachau were described in a lengthy report by the U.S. Naval Technical Mission, which swept across Europe in search of every scrap of industrial material and scientific data that could be garnered from the fallen Reich. This mission set the stage for the wholesale importation of more than 600 top Nazi scientists under the auspices of Project Paperclip, which the CIA supervised during the early years of the Cold War. Among those who emigrated to the U.S. in such a fashion was Dr. Hubertus Strughold, spelled S-T-R-U-G-H-O-L-D, the German scientist whose chief subordinates, Dr. Sigmund Ruff and Dr. Sigmund Rascher, were directly involved in, quote, aviation medicine experiments at Dachau, which included the mescaline studies. Despite recurring allegations that he sanctioned medical atrocities during the war, Strughold settled in Texas and became an important figure in America's space program. After Werner von Braun, he was the top Nazi scientist employed by the American government, and he was subsequently hailed by NASA as the, quote, father of space medicine, unquote. The CIA, meanwhile, had launched an intensive research effort geared toward developing special interrogation techniques. Two methods showed promise. Well, actually, we should say that those of you who've been listening to the broadcast that we've been having on KFJC since about 1979, 1980, know that we have talked at great length and in almost nauseating detail, nauseating at least to any citizen with an ounce of scruples and belief in good government, about the connections between our intelligence establishment and not only ours, of course, but many intelligence establishments and the drug trade. The fact that as the intelligence establishments began to become things unto themselves after World War II, and as they began to go with a policy of basically the Cold War policy of continuous engagement at low level, and as is becoming even more important in the Reagan 1980s, when the whole Cold War philosophy of small brushfire wars has become the order of the day. Well, it's very difficult to fund these types of wars through normal, legitimate, and legal political means, because most of the American people don't want to see their representatives voting for things like aid to the Contras, aid to the Mujahideen above a certain amount, things of that nature. And especially they don't want to see people supporting, say, the white hand death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala and places like that, which many times our intelligence and political establishments have felt to be the order of the day for continuing their anti-communist political philosophies. And as a result, they have to go elsewhere for money, and undetectable sums of money. And they found that the best ways to do this are gun running, drug running, or combinations thereof. And we have spent the last several months on these Radio Free America broadcasts looking in quite a bit of depth at how that has come to evolve as a national strategy, especially for the United States, but also for the Western nations in general.
Now, on this evening's broadcast, we're going to be taking a look at the intelligence services, particularly the CIA's role in the LSD phenomenon. Once again, we will see the Central Intelligence Agency involved in a pivotal way in the actual trafficking in LSD, and we'll also see the interrelationship between...
We are going to be covering a lot of it tonight, but obviously we cannot read the entire book to you, and it wouldn't hurt at all to go out and buy a copy and support researchers doing this kind of work. So, again, that small commercial over. Acid Dreams is the book we're going to be quoting from heavily tonight.
Okay, and again, we're going to begin by taking a look at the history of the CIA's research into LSD and the military's research into LSD, and observe the manner in which their interest in acid, which grew out of a number of different CIA mind control programs, part of which focused on the search for a truth serum. Basically, this is where LSD got its start in American society. It was, as we're going to read here very shortly, virtually an unknown phenomenon. There was almost no one doing LSD research in the United States until the CIA began pumping a lot of capital into that type of research. All of a sudden, there were a lot of people doing that research. Very quickly, the drug spread from the laboratory to the street, and we will be analyzing the possible role of the CIA in affecting that switch deliberately.
All right, starting out from Acid Dreams and reading about the early days of the search for a truth serum or a truth drug that would enable interrogators to basically pick the brains clean. This was the original idea, pick the brains clean of foreign spies.
It should be noted here that in the search for a truth serum, the CIA picked up where the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, left off during World War II, the OSS being America's wartime intelligence service during WW2.
After the war, the CIA and the military picked up where the OSS had left off in the secret search for a truth serum. The Navy took the lead when it initiated Project Chatter in 1947, the same year that the CIA was formed. Described as, quote, an offensive program, Chatter was supposed to devise means of obtaining information from people independent of their volition, but without physical duress. Toward this end, Dr. Charles Savage conducted experiments with mescaline, a semi-synthetic extract of the peyote cactus that produces hallucinations similar to those caused by LSD, at the Naval Medical Research...
Revolting commemorations of that phenomenon, and it should be said, too, that the book that we're going to rely on for a lot of our broadcasts this evening, although it has a lot of excellent information, does wax, I find, nauseatingly maudlin with regard to the psychedelic era, quote-unquote. The book sort of splits between devastating and insightful analysis and a lot of essentially nostalgic and I think fairly useless rumination and reminiscing about the glories of the psychedelic era. What conclusion one comes to about just what the CIA and other intelligence agencies were up to with regard to the use of LSD, again, for the purposes of brevity, the thesis of the entire broadcast this evening is basically that the CIA is totally inseparable from the LSD phenomenon in America, whether we look at LSD as a research tool, as it was initially, or whether we look at it as the underground recreational drug of choice that it became in the 1960s. Throughout the growth and spread of the LSD phenomenon, the CIA is there, and again, are completely inseparable from it. At the end of the broadcast this evening, we're going to speculate to a certain extent about some of the things that they may have had in mind with their efforts.
That's right. Not only for you ex-hippies out there, not only is 1987 the 20th anniversary of the, quote, Summer of Love, unquote, it's also the 40th anniversary of the formation of the CIA. And for those of you out there who are not previously familiar with the overlap that Dave mentioned between those two phenomena, you will be probably rather interested to stay tuned with us for tonight's broadcast. I just also wanted to mention that the book that we're going to be using heavily, not exclusively, but almost exclusively tonight, as Dave mentioned, is a book called Acid Dreams, subtitled The CIA, LSD, and the 60s Rebellion. The book is written by Martin A. Lee and Bruce Schlain, S-H-L-A-I-N, copyright 1985 by Grove Press, New York, and it is certainly worth your while. It is out right now. It is available, I think, in a lot of bookstores. It is probably also available in your local libraries and a variety of other places. And
the LSD traffic and the arms traffic, a theme that's become almost numbing and certainly fairly depressing as we've examined it over the course of these broadcasts, and indeed I think that could be safely said of the entire overview of the guns and drugs trades, which are in fact one trade and very closely interrelated. On this evening's broadcast, we're going to begin by taking a look at the growth of the LSD phenomenon, specifically the spread of LSD in American society is inextricable with the activities of the CIA and military in the United States. And we're going to begin taking a look at how LSD and its use and testing began out of a CIA program that was basically a search for a truth serum. We're going to take a look at the way in which the CIA's research into LSD spurred LSD research all around the country. Then we're going to take a look at the actual growth of the LSD subculture, so to speak. In particular, we're going to take a look at some of the main proponents of LSD or the use of LSD for recreational purposes. We're going to take a look at a guy named Captain Al Hubbard, who, unlike Ken Kesey or Tim Leary, was the original LSD pioneer. He also was a lifelong U.S. intelligence agent and a very, very mysterious character. We're going to take a look at the ubiquitous role of the CIA in the spreading of the LSD doctrine, so to speak, to leading American intellectuals. Whether we're looking at the aforementioned Tim Leary or Ken Kesey, whether we're looking at Aldous Huxley, whether we're looking at Allen Ginsberg, in the background of each of these key LSD proselytizers' introduction to that drug, we find the Central Intelligence Agency and people who were pivotally involved in the CIA's testing efforts. LSD research was virtually unknown in this country until the CIA, through a number of domestic funding conduits, began pumping millions of dollars into research with this drug. We're going to take a look at the CIA's role in the Summer of Love, the 20th anniversary of which is about to break upon us here in the Bay Area with a lot of, and this is my editorial comment,